The night Ezekiel Dunlap learned that Edna Conley had been promised to a man she feared more than death itself, he did not hesitate for a single breath before he saddled his horse and rode hard into the darkness. Because some things in this world are worth riding through hell for, and Edna Conley was worth every mile. It was the autumn of 1874, and the town of Caldwell Creek, Kansas sat on the edge of the open plains like a splinter in raw skin, raw, stubborn, and full of people trying to carve something decent out of a land that didn't owe them anything. The cattle drives had brought money and trouble in equal measure, and the railroad creeping closer every season had turned the town into a place where ambition and desperation pressed up against each other like strangers sharing a bed. Saloons lined the main street alongside a feed store, a blacksmith, a small church with a crooked steeple, and the Conley General Store, which had been the backbone of the family for going on 11 years. Edna Conley was 22 years old and had grown up behind that counter, learning the weight of flour sacks and the smell of fresh tobacco, and the names of every man, woman, and child who came through the door. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and she carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that made people take notice without understanding exactly why. She was not the sort of woman who made a fuss. She had learned early that the plains did not reward fussing. What they rewarded was patience and hard work, and the ability to keep your chin up when the wind tried to knock you down. Her father, Thomas Conley, was a good man who had been broken slowly by debt. The drought of 1872 had gutted their inventory. A bad winter the following year had kept the cattle drivers away from Caldwell Creek for 2 whole seasons, and with fewer cowboys coming through, fewer supplies were needed, and fewer coins crossed the counter of the Conley store. Thomas had borrowed money to keep the shelves stocked and the family fed, and the man he had borrowed from was Harlan Voss. Harlan Voss was 47 years old, broad as a barn door, and wore his power like a second coat. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county, had a piece of every saloon in a 30-mile radius, and had buried 2 wives in the span of 15 years, neither death ever fully explained to anyone's satisfaction. He had cold gray eyes that settled on a person like a stone dropped into still water, and the kind of smile that never quite reached those eyes, no matter how wide he stretched his mouth. Every person in Caldwell Creek knew that crossing Harlan Voss meant ruin, and most of them smiled at him in the street and prayed he never looked their direction too long. He had looked at Edna Conley for the better part of 2 years. Thomas Conley owed Harlan Voss $460, a sum that might as well have been $4,000 given the state of the store's ledger. When Voss rode up to the store on a Tuesday morning in late October with 2 of his hired men at his back, and his hat pulled low against a sharp autumn wind, Edna was stacking tins on the back shelf and listening to the murmur of voices from the front room. She heard her father's voice drop into that particular low register that meant fear. She set the tin down quietly and pressed herself closer to the doorway without stepping through it. "I'm a patient man, Thomas," Voss said, and his voice was smooth the way a knife blade is smooth. "But patience is a resource same as water. It runs dry." "I have every intention of repaying you," Thomas said. "The Henderson order comes through next month, and there is a freighter bringing goods from Wichita that I can turn a profit on before Christmas." "You have told me stories before," Voss said. "I find I am tired of stories." There was a silence that seemed to have weight and shape to it. Edna's hands pressed flat against the cool plaster wall beside the doorframe. "What I am proposing," Voss continued, "is an arrangement that settles your debt entirely and sees your family well provided for. Your daughter is a fine woman, any man can see that. I am prepared to offer her a secure life, a proper home, and the cancellation of every dollar you owe me." Edna stopped breathing. "I have discussed it some," Thomas said, and his voice was small and ashamed, "but Edna is a grown woman. I cannot simply—" "You can speak to her," Voss said. "Persuade her. The wedding would be quiet before the new year. She would want for nothing material." Another pause. "And you would want for nothing either. Think on it carefully, Thomas. Men who owe me money and cannot pay it tend to find the world becomes a smaller place. Edna did not wait to hear her father's response. She moved back through the storeroom, out the rear door, and stood in the cold morning air behind the building with her arms wrapped around herself, shaking with something that was more than cold. She had known Harlan Voss looked at her. She had felt it the way you feel a storm coming before the sky shows any evidence of it. She had told herself it was nothing. She had been wrong. The rear alley behind the store ran between two buildings and came out near the livery stable, and it was there that Ezekiel Dunlap found her not 20 minutes later, though at that point he did not know anything was wrong. He was simply returning from the farrier with his bay mare, Cinder, whose left rear shoe had needed resetting, and he nearly walked straight into Edna before he saw her standing with her back against the livery wall, her eyes bright and her jaw clenched in the particular way that meant she was holding herself together by force of will. Ezekiel Dunlap was 26 years old, lean and sun-dark from years of working cattle under an open sky, with hands that were rough-scarred and honest, and a face that wore its emotions plainly whether he wanted it to or not. He had come to Caldwell Creek 2 years prior, hired on at the Rafter D spread some 8 miles east of town, and he had become a fixture of the place in the way that quiet, reliable men become fixtures, not through spectacle but through steady presence. He was at the Conley store once or twice a week for supplies, had helped Thomas repair the store's roof after a hail storm the previous spring, and had developed, over many months of conversation across the counter, a regard for Edna Conley that he had never quite found the courage to name plainly, even to himself. He stopped when he saw her. "Miss Conley." She looked up and something in her expression shifted slightly, the way it did when she saw someone she trusted. "Mr. Dunlap, you all right?" He asked it simply because he was not a man who dressed things up. "I have had some news," she said. Her voice was carefully controlled, but her hands were not. They were pressed flat against the rough wooden wall of the livery behind her, and her knuckles were pale. He looped Cinder's lead around a post and came closer, not crowding her, but near enough that the conversation could be private. "What kind of news?" she told him. She told him plainly, the way she told everything, without embellishment but also without softening it. By the time she finished, Ezekiel's jaw had gone tight and his eyes had gone very still in that particular way that meant something was working through him that he wasn't going to let out into the open right then. "Your father," he said carefully. "What did he say back to Voss?" "I did not stay to hear it," she said. "I should go back in. I know I should, but I needed a moment." "Take all the moments you need," he said. He hesitated, then spoke again. "Edna." He had used her given name perhaps 3 times in 2 years, and each time it had seemed like something of consequence. "Voss is not a man to take no for an answer easily. What are you going to do?" "Tell him no," she said, and her chin came up with that particular Conley stubbornness. "Whatever it costs, I will tell him no." Ezekiel nodded slowly. He wanted to say more. There were words sitting at the back of his throat that had been sitting there for quite some time, and this did not seem like the right moment for them, so he swallowed them back down. "If you need anything," he said instead, "you know where to find me." She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Thank you, Mr. Dunlap." He watched her walk back toward the store, and then he stood in the alley with his hand on Cinder's neck for a long time before he moved. The following 3 days were uncomfortable ones. Edna returned to the store and told her father flatly that she would not marry Harlan Voss if he were the last man standing between Kansas and the ocean. Thomas Conley looked at his daughter with eyes full of guilt and relief in equal measure, and told her he had not agreed to anything, that he had only listened, that he would never force her hand. She believed him, because he was not the kind of man who would force her. He was simply the kind of man who had gotten himself into trouble and did not know how to get himself out of it, which was a different failing but a real one. The problem was Harlan Voss. Voss came back to the store on Friday afternoon, and this time Edna was behind the counter when he walked in. He removed his hat. He smiled his cold smile. He spoke to her with the particular kind of courtesy that was not really courtesy at all, but rather ownership assuming its property would comply. "I hope your father has spoken with you," he said. "He has," she said. "And my answer is no, Mr. Voss. I am grateful for whatever kindness you believe you are offering, but I am not available to be offered." His expression did not change very much. That was the frightening thing about him. "Give it some thought," he said. "A woman in your position should consider her options carefully." "I have considered them," she said. He nodded pleasantly and left. And that was worse than if he had argued, because it meant he was not done, only rearranging. Ezekiel heard about the exchange from Pete Harker, one of the other hands at the Rafter D, who had been in the store buying tobacco when Voss walked out. Pete had no particular stake in the story but liked to talk, and so by suppertime that evening Ezekiel knew that Edna had turned Voss down to his face, and that Voss had not looked anything like a man who was finished. He lay awake that night in his bunk in the Rafter D bunkhouse, staring up at the underside of the roof boards, and thought about Edna Conley and what it was that he had never said to her. He thought about the way she laughed at the dry things he said, which he had always taken pains not to show mattered to him. He thought about the afternoon she had shown him the letter from her cousin in Missouri, reading out the funny parts and the sweet parts, sitting on the porch step of the store in the last of the summer light, and how he had thought at the time that he would have been content to sit there and listen to her read letters for the rest of his foreseeable life. He was not a man who was accustomed to sentiment. He had grown up on a hardscrabble ranch in Texas, had lost his mother at 12 and his father at 17, had spent the years in between learning that the land required everything you had and gave back what it chose to give. He had learned to be self-sufficient in the way that leaves a man sometimes unsure what to do with softness when he encounters it. But Edna Conley had gotten under his guard so gradually that he had not noticed until she was already there, and now that he considered the situation honestly, lying in the dark with the wind picking up outside, he understood that what he felt for her was not a small thing. He also understood that none of that was going to matter if Harlan Voss decided to make things genuinely difficult for the Conley family, because Voss had the means to make things very difficult indeed. The following week passed in a kind of suspended unease. Edna ran the store with her usual efficiency and smiled at customers, and did not let anyone see how she felt about the shadow that had settled over the family business. She had spoken with her father several more times, and Thomas Conley had done the thing that guilty men do when they do not know what else to do. He had prayed and worried, and not acted decisively in either direction. Ezekiel came into the store on Wednesday for coffee and salt, which he did not particularly need, and stayed talking at the counter for half an hour, which he justified to himself as being no different from any other day. Edna seemed glad of the company. They talked about the cattle drive that had come through the previous weekend, and about the preacher's new wife who had arrived from Ohio and seemed to regard Kansas as a personal affront, and about the hawk that had been nesting in the elm tree behind the church since September and that nobody had the heart to disturb. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Edna asked, out of nowhere in the middle of a silence. "Leaving Caldwell Creek?" Leaned on the counter. "Leaving anywhere, going somewhere new, starting over somewhere that doesn't know your name yet." He considered the question the way he considered most things without hurrying toward an answer. "I have done it," he said. "Came here from Texas. Left everything I knew." He paused. "It is not the solution it seems like it would be. You carry yourself with you wherever you go." She looked at him. "And is carrying yourself wherever you go such a bad thing?" He almost said something then. He almost said that it depended entirely on what you were carrying, and that lately what he was carrying was mostly thoughts of her. He did not say it. But he looked at her for a moment that stretched out past its ordinary length, and she looked back, and something passed between them that did not require words, or at least that was what he told himself afterward to explain why neither of them spoke for those several seconds. "I suppose not," he said finally, which was not what he had intended to say at all. She smiled and turned back to the ledger she had been working on, and he gathered his supplies and left, and walked to his horse with the particular frustration of a man who knows he has just missed an opportunity and is not entirely sure he deserves another one. The thing that changed everything came on a Thursday evening in the second week of November, when the temperature had dropped sharply and the first real bite of winter was in the air. Ezekiel was returning from the western pastures on horseback, moving along the ridge road that curved past the backside of the Conley property, when he heard voices from below. He pulled Cinder to a stop out of instinct and listened, because voices on a back road after dark in that part of Kansas were worth stopping for. He recognized Harlan Voss's voice immediately. The man had a carrying quality to his speech, a depth that came from years of expecting to be heard. The other voice was Thomas Conley's, high and strained. Ezekiel held Cinder still and listened. "The note comes due December 1st, Voss was saying. That is 2.5 weeks away. I am giving you one more opportunity to consider the arrangement I have proposed, Thomas. My patience has genuinely reached its limit." "Edna will not agree," Thomas said. "She is a grown woman, Harlan. I am not asking you to drag her to the altar," Voss said. "I am asking you to make her understand the reality of your situation. The store, the house, everything you own carries my note. If you cannot pay, I am within my rights to collect." A long, terrible silence. "The ceremony would be the 28th, Voss said. "That gives her time to prepare and gives me time to draw up the paperwork canceling the debt. Think of it as a gift, Thomas. Think of it as the saving of everything you've built." "She will not," Thomas started. "She will if she loves you," Voss said, and the flatness with which he said it was somehow more terrible than any raised voice would have been. "Daughters who love their fathers find ways to make sacrifices. That has always been the way of things. Tell her." "I will have an answer by Sunday." Ezekiel sat motionless on Cinder for a long moment after the voices faded. His hands were very still on the reins, the way his hands got when everything else inside him was moving fast. He turned the horse quietly and rode back toward the Rafter D, but his mind was already somewhere else entirely, sorting through what he had heard with the methodical precision of a man who has spent years solving problems with the resources immediately available to him. Voss intended the wedding for the 28th of November. It was the 13th today. He had time, but not much of it, and the margin depended entirely on what Thomas Conley told his daughter and when, and on how much pressure a father's guilt could put on a daughter's resolve. He reached the ranch and put Cinder up and sat on the fence rail outside the barn in the cold for a long time, and then he thought about two things simultaneously that had always seemed separate, but now appeared to be related. The fact that Edna Conley was about to be handed to a man she feared, and the fact that Ezekiel Dunlap was a man who had spent 2 years finding reasons not to say what he meant. He got up off the fence rail and went inside and sharpened his pocket knife, and then sat on the edge of his bunk and said to the dark, quiet room, "You are a damn fool, Ezekiel." He went to the store the next morning. Edna was alone in the front room taking stock, moving between the shelves with a small ledger book in her hand and a pencil tucked behind her ear, and she looked up when the bell above the door rang and seemed both surprised and not surprised to see him. Her father was visible through the open back door, moving boxes in the storeroom. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." He took his hat off and held it in front of him, which was not a thing he usually did. "I need to speak with you about something." Something moved in her expression, a wariness, and beneath it something tired. "Is it about Harlan Voss?" He blinked. "You know, my father came to my room last night," she said quietly. She set the ledger book on the counter with deliberate care. "He told me about the conversation, about the date Voss has set, about what he stands to lose." Her voice was very even. "He was not ordering me to do it. He was weeping, actually, which was worse." Ezekiel turned his hat slowly in his hands. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I would not do it," she said. "And then I lay awake until 3 in the morning trying to figure out how to make that true without destroying him in the process." She looked at Ezekiel directly, with the straightforward honesty that was one of the things he had always admired about her. "We owe $460, Ezekiel. My father does not have it, the store does not have it, and Harlan Voss knows it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have $380 in a bank in Wichita." She stared at him. "I have been saving since I came here," he said. "Did not have much use for it. I do not spend a great deal." He cleared his throat. "It is not the full amount, but if you and your father could come up with the remainder $80, then the debt could be paid outright and Voss would have no hold over you." She kept staring at him. "Ezekiel, I cannot take your savings." "I am not offering it as charity," he said, and his voice was steady. "I am offering it as an investment. In something that matters to me." He stopped. The hat was still going around in his hands. He made himself stop turning it. "Edna, there are things I have wanted to say to you for quite some time and I have not said them, and I think perhaps that has been a mistake, so I am going to say them now." The storeroom went very quiet. Thomas Conley, visible through the back door, had stopped moving boxes. "I think you are the finest person I know," Ezekiel said. "You are honest and you are brave and you have a kind of steadiness in you that I have not found in anyone else, and I have been very aware of you for a long time, in a way that is more than neighborly." He took a breath. "I am not a wealthy man. I work cattle and I am good at it, and I have a little saved and I have my word, which I have never broken. I am not offering you money as a substitute for anything else. I am offering it because I want you to be free to make your own choices, and because I would like very much to be one of the things you choose to consider." The silence stretched out between them like a held breath. Edna Conley looked at Ezekiel Dunlap with those dark, clear eyes of hers, and she said, "I have been aware of you too, Ezekiel, in much the same way." He let out the breath he had not known he was holding. "But I cannot take your savings," she said again, more gently this time. "Not like this, not with all of this tangled up around it." "Then consider it a loan," he said, "with no interest and no rush. Consider it something between people who intend to figure things out together." She looked at him for a long moment. "Are you asking me to figure things out with you, in the general sense?" "In the general and the specific sense," he said. "Yes." Something softened in her expression, and for the first time in a week she looked like she might be breathing freely. "All right," she said. "Let us figure things out." They shook hands on it across the counter, and it should have been a ridiculous thing to shake hands on, and neither of them thought it was even slightly ridiculous. Thomas Conley quietly resumed moving boxes in the back room and did not comment on anything he had heard, though he was a man who would remember it for the rest of his life. The plan, as they worked it out over the next hour with Edna's ledger book open on the counter between them, was straightforward. Ezekiel would ride to Wichita on Saturday morning, withdraw his savings, and return by Sunday evening. The remaining $80, Edna had 40 in the family's cash box and believed she could borrow the remaining 40 from her friend Clara Beswick, whose husband ran the feed store and who had been offering to help in some form for months. With the full amount in hand, they would approach Voss before Sunday's deadline and settle the debt in full, in front of a witness if possible, with a written receipt. "He will not be pleased," Edna said. "No," Ezekiel agreed. "But he will have no legal ground to stand on, and Voss is the kind of man who operates within his legal rights while stretching them as far as they'll go. If the debt is paid, his hold on your family is gone. And if he retaliates in some other way, then we deal with that when it comes," he said. "One thing at a time." She looked at him. "You are very calm about this." "I am terrified," he said simply. "But I find that terror and calm can occupy the same body if you hold them right." She laughed at that quietly, and it was the laugh he had catalogued in the back of his memory over 2 years of knowing her slightly surprised, like she had not expected to be amused, with a brightness in it that changed the whole room. Saturday came with a cold gray sky that threatened rain without delivering it, and Ezekiel rode out before sunrise on Cinder, who was the most reliable horse he had ever worked with and who seemed to understand, in the way that good horses sometimes do, that the ride had a particular urgency to it. The road to Wichita was 60 miles, a hard day's ride, and he pushed the pace more than he usually would have, stopping twice to water Cinder at creek crossings and eating his own lunch in the saddle. Wichita in 1874 was a city in motion, full of cattle money and railroad money, and the particular chaos of a place that was becoming something before it had quite decided what. The bank was a solid brick building on Main Street, and the clerk inside looked slightly startled when Ezekiel requested a withdrawal of $380 in cash. But the account was legitimate, and the amount was there. And 20 minutes later Ezekiel walked back out into the cold Wichita afternoon, with the money folded into the inside pocket of his coat, and his hand resting against it through the fabric, a habit born of knowing which parts of Wichita were safe and which were not. He stayed the night at a boarding house and was back on the road before first light Sunday morning, riding south through the flat, cold land with the sky just beginning to lighten in the east and the money still in his coat pocket and his mind on Edna Conley. He was thinking about the way she had said, "I have been aware of you too, Ezekiel." He had replayed it perhaps 50 times in the past 48 hours. Not because he doubted it, but because he had been carrying his own feelings for so long, unnamed and unspoken, that having them met with something equally genuine felt like setting down a weight he had not known he was holding. He wanted to get back. He wanted to walk into the store and see her face and know that everything was going to be handled, and then he wanted to take the time to say everything else he had not yet said, more carefully and at greater length, without the pressure of a crooked man's deadline forcing the conversation. He reached Caldwell Creek in the early evening, riding in from the north just as the lamps were being lit in the town's windows. He went directly to the store. The lights were on, but the open sign was turned and the door was locked, which was unusual on a Sunday evening. The Conleys often kept the store open late for travelers coming through. He went around to the back and knocked. There was a long pause, and then the door opened and Thomas Conley was standing there looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 2 days. "Mr. Dunlap," Thomas said. "I have the money," Ezekiel said. $380. "Where is Edna?" Thomas Conley's face did something complicated. "Come inside." The kitchen at the back of the store was small and warm, and it smelled of coffee and the cornbread that had been made for supper and not much eaten. Ezekiel sat down at the table without being asked and looked at Thomas Conley and waited. "Voss came by this morning," Thomas said. He sat down across from Ezekiel and put his hands on the table and looked at them. He moved the date up. Ezekiel went very still. "What date?" "The wedding." Thomas would not meet his eyes. He said the 28th was too long to wait and he was moving it to Friday, this Friday, and he said Thomas stopped. His throat moved. He said if Edna was not at the church on Friday morning, he would call in the note immediately and have the marshal come Monday with the papers for the store and the house. "That is 4 days from now," Ezekiel said. "Yes." "And where is Edna?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "She went to Clara Beswick's this afternoon to try to borrow the money she needed. Clara's husband was not home." He paused. "Voss's man was there when she arrived." "Sitting on the Beswick porch, doing nothing, just sitting." Ezekiel felt something cold move through his chest that was not the November air. "He has men watching the town," Thomas said. "At least one at the bank, one at the road north and one at the road south. I think he knew you had ridden to Wichita. I think he has people who tell him things." "Where is Edna now?" Ezekiel asked again. "Here, upstairs." Thomas looked up finally. "She came home an hour ago. She has not come down. I went up to check on her and she was at the window with the curtains held to the side, watching the street." He swallowed. "She told me she was not going to marry Harlan Voss, and that was the last thing she said to me, and I believe her. But Ezekiel, I am afraid of what he will do if she refuses him in the open. He is not accustomed to being refused." "No," Ezekiel said, "he is not." He sat for a moment. Then he stood. "Let me go up and speak with her." Thomas did not object. Ezekiel went up the narrow staircase at the back of the kitchen, the steps creaking softly under his boots, and knocked at the only closed door. A pause. Then Edna's voice, "Father." "It is Ezekiel," he said. The door opened. She was fully dressed, her dark hair down but neatly combed, and she had clearly been crying at some point in the recent past, though she was not crying now. She looked at him with a complex mixture of relief and anxiety and something that might have been resolve. "You are back," she said. "I have the money," he said. "But I heard what your father told me about Voss moving the date and putting men on the roads." She stepped back and let him in. The room was small and tidy: a bed, a chest, a small desk with a lamp burning on it, a window that looked out over the main street. She went to the window as though pulled by gravity and stood with her arms crossed, looking down. "He had someone at the Beswick house before I even arrived," she said. "Clara was flustered and her husband was not home and she could not lend me anything without Robert's approval." She turned from the window. "He is boxing me in, Ezekiel. He is cutting off every avenue deliberately." "I know," he said. "He has men watching the roads. My father told me. So even if we had the full amount today, we could not simply walk into his office and hand it to him. He would find a reason to refuse it or delay until Friday comes." Ezekiel leaned against the doorframe and thought about this with the same methodical calm he had applied to everything since Thursday night, even though the inside of him was anything but calm. He thought about the roads and the watchers on them. He thought about Harlan Voss and the way that men like Voss operated within the law but at the very edges of it, using leverage and fear in the place of outright illegality. He thought about what resources were actually available to him. "The county seat is in Harrington," he said. "The county recorder's office is there. If we pay the debt, the note can be recorded as settled, and that becomes a matter of public record that Voss cannot simply ignore or override, even if he refuses to acknowledge it in person." She looked at him. "Harrington is 35 miles west." "Yes. And the roads, not all roads in Kansas are the same road," he said. "I know a way that follows the creek bed north and then cuts west across the open grassland. It would not occur to a man like Voss to put a watcher there because it is not a road anyone would take in November at night. It is hard riding, cold, dark." He paused. "But if you are willing—" She looked at him steadily. "What are you proposing exactly?" "That we ride to Harrington tonight," he said. "Right now. That we take the money, including whatever you have in the cash box, and we ride to Harrington and I pay the debt on record to the county, and we bring back a certified receipt that no court in Kansas would overturn. Voss's men are watching the roads, not a woman and a man on horseback crossing open range in the dark." Edna looked at him for a long moment. "That is a 35-mile ride in November at night." "It is," he said. "I would not ask it if I thought there was an easier way." She held his gaze. "You would ride through the night for this." "I would ride through the night for you," he said, and he did not look away when he said it. The silence that followed had a different quality than other silences. It was the kind that comes when something honest has been said in a place where only honest things belong. "Give me 10 minutes to change my boots," she said. He went back downstairs and told Thomas Conley what they intended. Thomas looked at him with an expression that was half fear and half something that was not quite gratitude but was in the same family as it. "She will be with me every minute," Ezekiel said. "I will bring her back before noon tomorrow. When we return, the debt will be settled on record and Voss will have nothing to hold over either of you." Thomas put out his hand. Ezekiel shook it. "Take care of her," Thomas said. "Yes, sir," Ezekiel said. "I intend to." Edna came down 10 minutes later in her heavy coat and wool skirt and boots that were better suited to riding than the ones she had been wearing, with a saddlebag over her shoulder. She had put her hair up and put on her hat, and she looked ready, which she was. She had the $40 from the cash box in a cloth pouch inside her coat. They went out the back way, through the kitchen and the storeroom and the rear alley. Ezekiel had left Cinder tied at the back of the livery, unsaddled for the night, and he saddled her quickly in the dark while Edna held the lamp low so the light would not spill out into the street. He borrowed a horse from the livery, a sturdy gray named Franklin, who he had ridden before and trusted, and saddled him for Edna. They rode out of Caldwell Creek from the north side of the livery, moving at a walk until the town's lights were behind them, and the open darkness of the plains was all around them. And then Ezekiel picked up the pace, and they rode side by side through the cold November night with the stars overhead, and the dry grass whispering around them, and the creek to their left running silver in the darkness. It was 11 miles to the place where the creek bent north, and then 24 miles across open grass to the outskirts of Harrington. The night was cold and clear, which was both a blessing and a difficulty. It made the riding easier, but it made the cold more penetrating. Edna rode with her hat pulled low and her scarf wrapped up over her chin, and she kept pace with him without complaint, which did not surprise him but which he noted with a particular kind of admiration. They did not talk much in the first hour, listening instead to the horses' hooves in the grass and the distant sounds of the plains at night, the cry of something in the middle distance, the rustle of the wind, the steady breathing of the animals beneath them. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was the comfortable silence of two people who know each other well enough that proximity is its own kind of conversation. Somewhere around the second hour, when the creek bend was behind them and the open grassland lay ahead in every direction, Edna said, "Tell me about Texas." He glanced at her. She was looking straight ahead, her profile sharp in the starlight. "What do you want to know about it?" "Anything. What it was like growing up there. What made you leave?" He thought about it. "It is bigger than Kansas," he said, "which sounds impossible, but it is true, more sky somehow. Or maybe it just feels that way when you are young and the sky is the biggest thing you know." He paused. "My father's ranch was in the hill country, west of San Antonio. Limestone hills and cedar trees and rivers that ran clear green in the summer. It was beautiful and hard at the same time, the way most beautiful things are." "And your mother?" "She died of fever when I was 12. There were 4 of us children, and after she went it was mostly my father and the land and the work. My father died of a heart that gave out when I was 17, and the ranch went to his brother who had his own family and did not particularly need or want me around." He said this without bitterness, as plain fact. "So I rode north. I had done cattle work since I was old enough to stay in a saddle, and that seemed like the thing to take with me." She was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry about your parents. It was a while ago," he said. "I have made peace with most of it." "Has it been lonely?" she asked, moving around, not belonging anywhere particular. He considered the question with his usual honesty. "It has," he said, "though I am not sure I recognized it as loneliness for a long time. I was so busy with the day-to-day of things that I did not examine what was missing underneath." He paused. "Coming to Caldwell Creek was different. I do not know exactly why I stayed as long as I have, or perhaps I do know and was not admitting it to myself." She turned to look at him, and even in the dark he could see the small smile at the edge of her mouth. "Perhaps," she said. "Tell me about growing up in the store," he said. She laughed softly. "What is there to tell? I learned to count in the back room among the flour sacks. My mother taught me to keep ledgers before she taught me to sew, which I think tells you something about her priorities. She believed that a woman who understood numbers could never be entirely helpless, and she was right about that." She paused. "She died 4 years ago, pneumonia. It was very fast." "I am sorry," he said. "She would have liked you," Edna said. "She liked straightforward people, people who said what they meant." She looked ahead again at the dark grass. "My father is a good man who got into bad trouble," she said. "He is not equipped for someone like Harlan Voss. My mother would have managed it better, I think. She had a practical coldness that served her very well in business." "You have some of that," he said. "Some," she agreed. "I also have my father's inconvenient tendency to care too much about things." "I do not think that is inconvenient," he said. She glanced at him again. "No, no," he said. "I think it is one of the better things about you." She was quiet for a moment that felt warm in spite of the cold. "Ezekiel," she said. "Yes." "When this is finished," she said carefully, "and the debt is paid and Voss has no hold over my family, what happens then?" "What would you like to happen?" he asked. She seemed to consider this seriously the way she considered everything. "I think I would like to have a conversation with you," she said, "a proper one about what sort of things you might be interested in the general and specific sense, as someone once said to me." He smiled in the dark. "I think that can be arranged." "Good," she said. And they rode on. The miles passed with the unhurried movement of the land beneath them, the grass rolling out in the starlight like something endless, and the cold settled in around them the way cold does in the open plains of Kansas, not sudden but accumulating, so that after a while you are simply part of it, not fighting it but moving through it. They stopped once to let the horses drink at a small creek crossing and to rest them for 15 minutes, standing close together in the dark while the horses put their heads down to the water. "Are you cold?" he asked. "Profoundly," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, "but I have been colder." "Cowboys," she said, with a tone that managed to be both affectionate and exasperated simultaneously, which made him laugh. He reached into the saddlebag and produced a blanket that he had rolled up there out of the kind of habit that comes from years of long rides. He offered it to her without ceremony, and she took it without the ceremony of refusing and wrapped it around her shoulders over her coat, and they stood there in the dark beside the creek in companionable cold, and he found himself thinking that this was, objectively, an unusual way to begin a courtship, and also that he would not have changed any of it. They rode into the outskirts of Harrington at a little past 2 in the morning. The town was dark and quiet, the streets empty, the only light coming from the night lamp of the hotel and the faint glow of the marshal's office. They put the horses up at a stable whose night man looked at them with sleepy curiosity and did not ask questions, and Ezekiel paid for the stalls and the feed, and they walked stiffly to the hotel, where he got them 2 separate rooms on the second floor, and they parted in the hallway with a kind of formality that felt both necessary and slightly absurd given the night. They had just spent riding side by side across 35 miles of dark Kansas grassland. He did not sleep much. He lay on the boarding-house bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the morning, and about what came after the morning, and about Edna Conley asleep or not asleep in the room next to his. Mostly he thought about what her face would look like when they walked out of the county recorder's office with the receipt in hand, and the debt settled and Harlan Voss stripped of the only leverage he had ever had. At 8 in the morning he knocked on her door, and she answered it immediately, already fully dressed and looking alert in the way that people look when they have had enough of lying in bed waiting for morning to permit them to get up. They went to the hotel dining room and had eggs and coffee and biscuits and did not talk much, but the silence was easy and full of things that did not need to be said yet because there was time now, or at least the promise of time. The county recorder's office opened at 9. The recorder himself, a small man named Edgar Pruitt with ink permanently stained into the creases of his fingers, looked over the paperwork of the Conley debt with the careful attention of a man who has looked over a great many documents in his time. He looked at the promissory note that Edna had brought, signed in Harlan Voss's name, and he looked at the cash that Ezekiel counted out on the counter, $380, and at the $40 in the cloth pouch that Edna added to it. "That is $420, Pruitt said. "The note is for $460. "I am aware," Edna said. "We are $40 short." She paused. "But we have the principal and more than 3/4 of the outstanding amount, and the note's due date is December 1st, which is still 2 weeks away. We are not in default." Pruitt looked at her. "That is correct," he said slowly. "Can you accept a partial payment and record it?" She asked, with a schedule for the remainder to be delivered no later than November 25th before the note's due date. Pruitt studied her over his spectacles. "I can record a partial payment, yes. The remainder would need to be paid directly to the note holder to settle the debt fully, unless you wish to have the remainder recorded here as well when it is available." "Record it here," Ezekiel said. "Both portions. We will have the $40 within the week. It was a stretch. He was not certain how they would raise the $40 in the time remaining. But he was certain that a partial payment, on record at the county office, with a formal schedule for the balance, would significantly complicate Voss's ability to move against the Conleys on the grounds of the debt. A judge would look at that record and see a family attempting to settle their obligation in good faith, and Voss knew enough about law to know that. Pruitt recorded the payment. He wrote out a receipt in his careful hand. $420 applied against the Conley promissory note held by Harlan J. Voss, with a formal notation of the balance of $40 to be settled before the 1st of December. And he stamped it with the county seal and signed it and gave Edna the original and put the copy in the record book. She held the receipt in both hands for a moment and looked at it, and Ezekiel watched her face and saw the particular kind of relief that comes from having done the thing that needed to be done, not euphoria, but a deep settling, like a foundation that had been shaking finding solid ground again. "Thank you," she said to Pruitt. "Ma'am," he said, and went back to his papers. They walked out into the Harrington morning, which was cold and bright, the sun new and low in the east throwing long shadows across the main street. Edna tucked the receipt carefully into her coat's inner pocket and buttoned it over, and then stood for a moment in the sunlight with her face tipped up slightly, eyes half closed. Ezekiel stood beside her and let her have the moment. $40, she said finally. "We still need $40. Clara Beswick's husband will be home by now," he said. "And I have some credit at the feed store that I have not collected on. And there is old Tom Harker, who owes me 2 days' labor from last spring and who prefers to pay in cash." She lowered her face and looked at him. "You have thought about this?" "I thought about it all night," he said, "while I was supposed to be sleeping." She smiled at him, and it was not the brief smile of a woman being polite or even the brighter smile that she used when something genuinely amused her. It was a quieter, deeper smile than either of those, the kind that starts in the eyes before it reaches the mouth, and it was aimed directly at him with a straightforwardness that made something in his chest do something he would not have described to anyone, but that felt like suddenly having enough room. "Thank you," she said, "for all of this. For the money and the idea and the riding through the night. For everything. I told you it was an investment," he said. "In something that matters to you," she said, repeating his own words back to him. "Yes," he said. She reached out and took his hand, right there on the main street of Harrington, with people going about their morning around them and the sun coming in low and cold and clear. Her hand was warm inside her glove, and she held his hand the way you hold something you intend to keep. He closed his fingers around hers. They stood like that for a moment on the street, and then she said, "We should get the horses and start back." "We should," he agreed. They did not let go of each other's hands until they had to mount. The ride back to Caldwell Creek was nothing like the ride out. The daylight made the land different, opening it up and spreading it in every direction. The brown grass and the pale sky and the far-off smear of darker hills to the west. And they rode at a steady pace without urgency now, the emergency behind them and the future unresolved but no longer threatening in the same sharp way. They talked more on the return ride than they had going out, filling in the spaces that had been occupied by cold and darkness and necessity. She told him about learning to ride as a girl, on a bad-tempered pony named Sergeant who had bitten her 3 times in one summer, and whom she had ultimately decided to simply outmaneuver rather than conquer. He told her about the summer he had turned 19 and ridden a cattle drive to Abilene and everything that had happened on that drive, some of it instructive and some of it simply ridiculous. She told him about the books she read, ordered from a catalog out of St. Louis, and that she kept them in a box under her bed because her father thought reading too many books gave women ideas above their station, which she considered a delightfully old-fashioned position. "Do you have ideas above your station?" he asked. "Constantly," she said. "I have been having them for years." "I hope you intend to keep having them," he said. She looked at him sideways with something warm in her expression. "I intend to have a great many things I have not had before," she said. They reached Caldwell Creek in the early afternoon. They did not ride directly into town on the main road. Instead, they came in from the west, circling around the edge of the settlement and coming in through the back streets, not because they were doing anything wrong, but because it seemed prudent to not ride through Voss's men's line of sight before they had spoken to Voss himself. Thomas Conley came out of the back door of the store before they had fully dismounted, as though he had been watching the direction they would come from for hours, which he probably had. He looked at the two of them and then at Edna's face, and something in him visibly eased. "It is done?" he asked. Edna pulled the receipt from her coat and handed it to him. He read it with shaking hands. "Most of it," she said. "We still need the 40. Robert Beswick should be home now, and Ezekiel has a few other ideas." Thomas Conley looked at Ezekiel Dunlap over the top of the receipt, and his eyes were bright with an emotion that Ezekiel acknowledged with a small nod, because it was not the kind of thing that required words. The $40 came together by the following afternoon. Clara Beswick's husband Robert provided 20 without hesitation when Robert Beswick heard the full situation, because Robert Beswick was a man who liked clear accounts and disliked Harlan Voss on general principle. Tom Harker paid his labor debt in cash, $10 and some change. Ezekiel's credit at the feed store accounted for the remainder, and he settled that separately with a morning's labor the following week. The full $460 was recorded at the county recorder's office on Thursday morning, with Ezekiel and Edna both present and Edgar Pruitt again serving as witness. The promissory note was marked satisfied in the public record, and the receipt issued was comprehensive and official and bore the county seal. Harlan Voss was notified by courier that same afternoon. He came to the store on Friday morning, the day he had set for the wedding, and he came alone, which was in itself a kind of acknowledgment. He stood in the store's front room with his hat in his hand, and he looked at Edna behind the counter and then at Ezekiel, who was standing to one side in the room because he had arrived half an hour earlier and had no intention of going anywhere. "I received the notification," Voss said. His voice was very even. "Good," Edna said. "Then you understand the debt is fully settled." "I do," he said. He looked at her for a long moment with his cold gray eyes, and then he looked at Ezekiel. "You are behind this," he said. "Miss Conley made every decision herself," Ezekiel said. "I provided some assistance, as a neighbor would." Voss looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his expression that was calculating and cold, and also, Ezekiel thought, aware that this was a finished thing. Voss was a man who operated within the law, and the law was now clearly on one side of this, and he knew it. "Good day," Voss said, and put his hat back on and left. The bell above the door rang once as it closed behind him. Edna let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and foundational. Ezekiel moved to the counter and leaned on it the way he had 100 times before, but everything about it felt different today. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She looked at him with those dark, clear eyes. "You said you wanted to have a conversation," she said, "in the general and specific sense." "I did," he said. "I believe we now have time for it," she said. He came around the counter. She was standing near the back wall with her hand resting on the shelf beside her, and he stopped a few feet from her and looked at her directly. "Edna," he said, "I would like to court you, properly and openly, with your permission and your father's knowledge. And I would like to do it with the honest intention of asking you something more significant later on, when we have had the time to know each other in that way." He paused. "I know that is probably more than the standard opening statement." "It is somewhat comprehensive, yes," she said, and there was laughter in her voice but tenderness underneath it. "I believe in being clear," he said. "I spent 2 years being unclear, and I find I prefer this." She stepped forward and closed the distance between them. "I would like that," she said. "Very much, all of it." He looked at her. She looked at him. And then, because it seemed like the only thing to do and also the most natural thing in the world, he took her face gently in his hands and kissed her for the first time, right there in the Conley General Store in the November light. And it was not a dramatic thing, and it was not a tentative thing. It was the kind of kiss that feels like arriving somewhere you did not know you were headed, but that is exactly where you meant to be. She kissed him back with exactly the same directness that characterized everything else she did. From the back room, Thomas Conley made a sound that was probably him deciding that the inventory in the storeroom needed urgent attention. They drew apart and looked at each other, and both of them were smiling, which was embarrassing and entirely worth it. "I should probably speak to your father," Ezekiel said. "You probably should," she agreed. "He is going to be insufferably sentimental about it." "I will manage," Ezekiel said. He did manage. The conversation with Thomas Conley took place at the kitchen table that evening over coffee, and Thomas was indeed somewhat sentimental, and also deeply grateful in a way that he expressed awkwardly and sincerely, and Ezekiel received it with the grace that honest people show one another when emotion is unavoidable. "She is everything her mother was," Thomas said. "And everything her mother was not, if you understand me. She is her own person entirely." "I know," Ezekiel said. "That is the whole of it, really." Thomas Conley shook his hand again and poured more coffee, and they talked about the debt and the store's prospects without the weight of Voss pressing on them, and it was a genuinely pleasant evening, which none of them had expected this week to contain. The courtship that followed was, by the standards of Caldwell Creek in 1874, both conventional and entirely its own thing. Ezekiel came to the store on his days off from the rafter D and helped with whatever needed doing: a broken window latch that had needed replacing since summer, a shipment of goods that needed organizing, the front step that had developed a dangerous wobble. He and Edna walked in the evenings when the weather permitted, along the creek road with the bare November trees standing in the last of the light, and they talked about everything: books and cattle and family and the future, and the things they each wanted and feared and hoped for. She was funny in a quiet, precise way that consistently surprised him and always would. She had opinions about everything and expressed them without apology, and she listened to his opinions with the kind of genuine attention that is rarer than most people understand. They disagreed sometimes about politics, about religion, about whether the new preacher was improving or not, and the disagreements were interesting rather than damaging, because they were conducted between two people who had decided to be honest with each other. December came in cold and clear. The store's business improved as the holiday season approached, and with the debt settled and the threat of Voss lifted, Thomas Conley seemed to straighten up and breathe again, and he started ordering inventory with the kind of optimism that suggests a man who has recovered his nerve. Edna managed the books with her usual precision and began to have ideas about expanding the store's catalog in the spring, a conversation she had with Ezekiel on a walk in early December that lasted 2 hours and covered a great deal of practical ground. "You have a business mind," he said, watching her work through the numbers in the air between them, the way she did when she was thinking hard. "I have my mother's business mind," she said. "I have been applying it to a relatively small canvas. I think it could bear a larger one." "I think so too," he said, and then, because the moment seemed right and the conversation had arrived at a natural clearing in the middle of which something could be said, "I am going to speak plainly." She stopped walking. "You always speak plainly." "I mean more plainly than usual," he said. He turned to face her on the creek road, the bare trees around them and the cold sky above, and everything very still in the particular way that winter evenings in Kansas are still. "I told you in October that I wanted to court you with the honest intention of asking something more significant. I have been thinking about when to ask it, and I have come to the conclusion that waiting for the perfect moment is a fool's errand, because the moment is always the one you are in." She looked at him. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. "Edna Conley," he said, "I love you. I have loved you for a considerable amount of time in which I was doing a poor job of saying so, and I do not intend to do a poor job of it any longer. I would like to marry you, if you'll have me. I cannot offer you great wealth, but I can offer you honesty and steadiness and a genuine willingness to be wherever you are, and I think we would build something good together." She looked at him for a moment that stretched in the winter quiet. "Ezekiel Dunlap," she said, "I love you too. I have been aware of this for some time now." A small pause. "Yes. Yes," he said. "Yes," she said firmly, with the Conley chin up and the dark eyes bright. "To all of it." He stepped forward and took her in his arms right there on the creek road, and she pressed her face against the front of his coat, and they stood like that in the cold for a long, warm moment while the creek ran nearby and the evening settled around them with a kind of peace that neither of them had experienced for weeks. He kissed her hair. "Your father is going to cry again," he said. She laughed against his chest. "Absolutely he will," she said. "He has been waiting for this since you fixed the roof." The engagement was announced to the town of Caldwell Creek in the comfortable, informal way that such announcements happened in small frontier towns. It spread from the Beswick family to the blacksmith's wife to the preacher's new Ohio wife, who turned out to be considerably more warm-hearted about local events than she was about Kansas in general. And by Sunday it was common knowledge and the source of several approving conversations over the pews at the morning service. Harlan Voss heard about it as he heard about most things. He said nothing publicly. He did not congratulate anyone. He continued to conduct his cattle business with the same cold efficiency as always, and he moved through Caldwell Creek's social sphere as he always had, and he and Ezekiel passed each other in the street once in mid-December with the careful neutrality of men who have settled their business and have nothing further to discuss. It was not warmth, but it was over and finished, and the distinction mattered. The wedding was planned for the following spring, April of 1875, which gave time for Ezekiel to make arrangements, and for the engagement to be properly observed, and for Edna's cousin in Missouri to be given enough notice to travel out for the occasion. It also gave Ezekiel time to do the thing he had been quietly thinking about since November, which was to speak with the owner of the Rafter D about his intentions. He had a conversation with old John Deering, who owned the Rafter D, on a January morning in the ranch office, a small room full of land maps and ledgers that smelled of pipe tobacco and horse leather. He told Deering that he intended to marry and that his arrangements would need to change, and that he had been thinking about whether the Rafter D had space for a foreman's position, which would carry a salary sufficient for a small family, and eventually, some possibility of earning equity in the operation. Deering, who was 64 years old and had been running cattle since before Ezekiel was born, looked at him across the desk for a long time. "You've been my best hand for 2 years," he said. "I was wondering when you were going to ask." The foreman's position came with a small house on the north edge of the Rafter D property, a 2-room structure that had been built for the previous foreman and that had stood empty for a year. It needed some work, but it had a good roof and a sound floor and a fireplace that drew well, and Ezekiel spent his weekends through February and March making it into something habitable and eventually into something that felt like a home, replacing the cracked window glass, rebuilding the front porch step, whitewashing the interior walls. Edna came out on 3 separate Saturdays to give opinions, which she had in abundance, and on the 3rd Saturday she brought curtains she had made from fabric ordered from St. Louis, a dark red that looked, she said, like something warm, which was exactly what a Kansas house needed to be. "This is your house too," he said on that 3rd Saturday, watching her hang the curtains in the front window while he stood in the room feeling like something he had not felt in a long time. "I want you to know that. Whatever you want changed or added or different, we decided together." She looked at him from the step stool she was standing on. "I know," she said. "I am already planning a kitchen garden. There is a perfect south-facing spot beside the east wall." He smiled. "I know. I dug it up last weekend." She stared at him. "You dug a kitchen garden in March." "The ground was soft from the thaw," he said. "It seemed like the right moment." She came down from the step stool and looked at him with that quiet, deep smile, and then she stood on her toes and kissed him, which was another in a series of things that had made the winter feel entirely different from any winter that had preceded it. April arrived with the particular optimism of a plain spring sudden green breaking through the brown grass. The sky, a deeper blue than it had been since September, the wind still cold but carrying something alive in it. The church in Caldwell Creek had its crooked steeple, but it was well built and warm, and on the morning of the 14th of April, 1875, it held the entirety of Caldwell Creek's population and a fair portion of the surrounding farms and ranches, which said something about the regard in which both Ezekiel Dunlap and Edna Conley were held. Edna wore her mother's dress, which had been let out and reshaped with the help of Clara Beswick, who was good with a needle, and which fit her now in a way that made Thomas Conley grip the back of a pew and breathe carefully for a moment when he saw her coming down the stairs. The dress was ivory wool with small pearl buttons, and she wore her dark hair up with sprigs of early wildflower that her cousin Margaret from Missouri had helped her arrange that morning. She looked like herself, which was the best thing she could have looked like. Ezekiel was standing at the front of the church in his Sunday coat, which was the best coat he owned, and he had polished his boots until they reflected light, and his dark hair was combed, and he had shaved that morning with unusual care, and he watched Edna walk toward him on her father's arm, and he had the experience that serious people sometimes have in important moments of seeing things very clearly, all at once. The room and the people in it and the light through the small windows and Edna coming toward him through all of it, and he thought, "This is the thing I was riding toward all along, and I did not know it until now, and it is exactly right." Thomas Conley put his daughter's hand in Ezekiel's with a steady look that held several years and several emotions in it, and Ezekiel met it squarely. The ceremony was performed by the new preacher, who turned out to be very good at weddings even if his Sunday sermons ran long, and the vows were said with a directness and sincerity that made several people in the front pews reach for handkerchiefs. When the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Ezekiel kissed her the way he had kissed her the first time, not dramatically but honestly, and in a way that felt like a rival. The reception was held in the open space beside the church, in the April sun, with food that the women of Caldwell Creek had contributed in the generous tradition of frontier communities, and with fiddle music provided by a man named Aurelius Finch, who played with more enthusiasm than technique, but whose enthusiasm was sufficiently high to more than compensate. Thomas Conley danced with his daughter and cried exactly as predicted, and Clara Beswick danced with her husband Robert, and Ezekiel's foreman friend from the Rafter D, a steady man named Garrett Cole, proposed an entirely sincere toast that used the words admirable and about time in the same sentence, which caused laughter. Cousin Margaret from Missouri, who was a practical woman of 30 with sharp eyes and a good humor, cornered Ezekiel at the refreshments table and looked at him with the directness of a woman who intends to assess her cousin's new husband accurately. "Edna tells me," she said, "that you rode 35 miles through the dark and gave away your life savings. $380, he said, "and it came back." "It is the principle," Margaret said. "Do you love her?" "Yes," he said, "completely." Margaret looked at him for another moment. "Good," she said, and went back to the dancing. They moved into the foreman's house on the Rafter D property that evening, arriving after the celebration with the stars out and the spring air full of the smell of new grass, and Edna stood in the front room with the red curtains and the whitewashed walls and looked around with an expression that Ezekiel read as the specific combination of happiness and seriousness that characterized all the things she cared about most. "It looks like home," she said. "It is home," he said. She turned to look at him. "Yes," she said, "it is." The spring settled into summer, and summer into fall, and the Rafter D grew in the sure and steady way that good ranches grow when managed well, and Ezekiel Dunlap proved to be an excellent foreman in the same way he had been an excellent hand, thorough and fair, and unsparing with himself in equal measure to what he expected of others. John Deering took to stopping by the foreman's house on Sunday afternoons to sit on the new porch that Ezekiel had built and drink coffee with the pair of them. And these visits became a fixture of the week that all three of them were quietly fond of. Edna continued to help her father at the store through the spring and into the summer, working 3 days a week and spending the others at the house, developing the kitchen garden, which proved as productive as its south-facing position suggested it would, and ordering things from the St. Louis catalog, with the methodical pleasure of a woman who has always known what she wanted and now has appropriate space for it. She also spent time in the evenings with the ledger books, not the store's but her own, a set of figures and notes she kept in a journal that had to do with a plan she had been developing through the winter for a small ordering business that would serve the farms and ranches in the surrounding area, coordinating bulk supply orders and taking a margin on the arrangement. She put the plan in front of Ezekiel on a Tuesday evening in June, spreading the papers across the kitchen table. He read through everything carefully, which took a while because she was thorough, and then he said, "This is very good." "I know," she said. "The margin on the bulk orders is conservative," he said. "You could go higher." "I could," she said, "but starting conservative builds trust, and trust is worth more than margin in the long run." "Your mother's business sense," he said. "My own business sense," she said. "My mother gave me the foundation. I built on it." He looked at her across the table with her papers spread between them and the lamplight on her face and thought, not for the first time, that the particular quality of being Edna Conley was something he would never entirely exhaust the study of, which was exactly how he wanted it to be. "Start in the fall," he said. "Let me help you set up the first round of contacts." "I was going to ask you to," she said. "You know the ranches." "I know all of them," he said. "And they know me. That helps." By the following spring, Edna's ordering business had 15 regular accounts and a reputation for reliability that spread faster than she had anticipated, because the farms and ranches around Caldwell Creek had been waiting for exactly this kind of service without knowing they were waiting for it. Thomas Conley watched his daughter's enterprise with a complicated expression of pride and mild bewilderment, and was eventually persuaded to let her run the coordinating operation out of a corner of the store, which increased traffic to the store itself as a side effect. In the winter of 1875, approaching Christmas, Edna told Ezekiel on a quiet evening by the fireplace that they were going to have a child. She told him with the same directness she brought to everything, looking at him squarely and waiting to see what his face would do. What his face did was go through several things in rapid succession: surprise, and then something that opened up and outward in a way he could not have described, but that she understood perfectly because she had felt the same thing when she had understood the truth herself 3 days earlier. "When?" he said. "July, I think," she said, "if I have counted right." He came off the chair he was sitting on and knelt in front of the one she was in, which was something he had never done before and which felt entirely natural. He took her hands. She looked at him with that quiet, deep smile. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Some," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. "Is that all right?" "It is honest," she said. "So yes." He raised her hands and pressed his lips against them, and she put her free hand on his hair, and the fire crackled in the fireplace, and the Kansas winter pressed gently at the windows, and neither of them said anything more for a while because nothing more needed to be said. Their son was born in July of 1876, on a hot Tuesday morning when the light came in golden through the red curtains, and the summer birds made a considerable noise in the elm tree outside the window. He was healthy and loud, and had his mother's dark eyes and his father's obstinate jaw, and they named him Samuel Thomas Dunlap Samuel, because Ezekiel had loved a gray tuncle by that name who had been the kind of man worth remembering, and Thomas for his grandfather, who received the information of his namesake by sitting down abruptly in the nearest chair and requiring a moment to compose himself. The Rafter D. Foreman's house was no longer quite large enough for 3. a fact they had been aware of for some months. John Deering, now 67 and increasingly glad to have someone reliable running the daily operations, had spoken in the spring about the possibility of Ezekiel taking on a formal partial ownership of the ranch in exchange for a longer commitment and continued management. And by the fall of 1876, those conversations had become a real arrangement, with papers drawn up and signed at the county recorder's office. The same Edgar Pruitt, the same ink-stained fingers, the same county seal. And a clause in the arrangement that set aside a plot of land on the northeast corner of the Rafter D property for the building of a larger house. Ezekiel built it the following winter, hiring 2 men from town to help, working himself every day he could spare from the cattle operation. It was a proper house this time, 4 rooms and a kitchen, and a proper porch that faced east so the morning sun came in full, and a second bedroom for Samuel, and the room beside it that Edna had quietly designated in her own mind as necessary for whatever came after Samuel, though she did not say so to Ezekiel until the spring. He was building the fence line along the east pasture when she came out with his lunch and mentioned it, and he set the fence post digger down and looked at her with an expression of uncomplicated delight. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He picked her up, which he knew she generally regarded as undignified and which she never objected to when he did it anyway, and swung her around once in the April sunshine before setting her down, and she said, "Ezekiel," in the tone she used when she was trying not to laugh, and he said, I know," and kissed her instead, which she was not trying not to do. Their second child was a daughter, born in October of 1877, with red hair that neither parent could explain, and that Thomas Conley said must have come from Edna's maternal grandmother, who had been a red-haired woman from Tennessee. They named her Clara Me Dunlap, for Clara Beswick, who had been a steadfast friend through everything, and for the simple reason that Me was a name they both liked the sound of. She was loud and curious and absolutely certain of her own importance from the first week of her life, which suggested she was going to be perfectly equipped for the world as it was. Thomas Conley sold the store in the spring of 1878 to a young couple from Missouri and came to live at the edge of the Rafter D property in a small house that Ezekiel helped him build, close enough to be family and far enough to be independent, which was what Thomas needed and what everyone understood without saying. He spent his mornings in the garden and his afternoons playing with his grandchildren and his evenings on the porch watching the Kansas light change in the west, and he told Edna one Sunday that he felt he had earned this life through an accidental route, but that he was grateful for it every day. "You are going to be sentimental about it," she told him. "I am sentimental," he said. "I have made peace with this." The ordering business that Edna had started from the corner of the store had by 1878 grown into a genuine operation with a proper name, Dunlap and Associates Supply Coordination, which she had insisted on naming with Ezekiel's name first because he had provided the initial contacts and the capital, and she was not going to be the kind of woman who failed to acknowledge what was true. And she ran it from a small office she had arranged in the new house. Working mornings, while Samuel played in the corner with blocks and Clara, Me slept in her crib with the total unconscious confidence of someone who has never doubted that the world would wait for her. Harlan Voss left Caldwell Creek in 1878, which was not something anyone had expected, but which was received with the quiet relief that communities feel when a figure of oppressive power removes himself from the immediate landscape. He had, the story went, made an arrangement with a land developer from Chicago to sell his cattle holdings and take up something else in a different part of the country. No one inquired too deeply into the particulars. He was gone, and the air was lighter afterward, and the particular shadow that had sat over certain conversations in Caldwell Creek, since before anyone could clearly remember, simply lifted one ordinary Tuesday and did not return. Ezekiel and Edna were having supper when the news came via Pete Harker, who had remained a fixture of the Rafter D bunkhouse and who still liked to talk, but had become, over the years, a genuinely affectionate figure in their lives. He told them about Voss over the kitchen table and then accepted a piece of cornbread, and the conversation moved on to other things: the state of the east pasture fence, a letter Edna had received from cousin Margaret in Missouri with news of Margaret's own engagement, the question of whether Samuel's independent nature was going to be a delight or a difficulty as he got older. "Both," Edna said. "Definitely both," Ezekiel agreed. John Deering died in the winter of 1879, quietly, in his sleep, which was the kind of ending that a man who had worked hard all his life and done it honestly is entitled to. He left his portion of the rafter deed jointly between his daughter in Topeka and Ezekiel, with a letter in his desk that Ezekiel only read once, and that he kept folded in the inside pocket of his good coat because some things belong there. The daughter, a practical woman named Helen, preferred the money to the cattle and sold her portion to Ezekiel for a fair price over 2 years, which stretched them considerably, but which by 1881 was paid in full and left Ezekiel Dunlap as the owner of a working ranch of 430 acres in the middle of Kansas, which was not the same as a great fortune, but was a thing that he had built from nothing through steadiness and time, and that was accordingly worth more to him than a great fortune would have been. Caldwell Creek grew in the years that followed. The railroad came through in 1880, which changed everything about the cattle trade and created new business for everyone positioned to take advantage of it, and Edna's ordering operation shifted to accommodate rail freight, which expanded its scope considerably and brought in clients as far away as Salina and Newton. She hired a woman named Frances Holt to help with the books in 1881, which freed 2 mornings a week for other things, including a correspondence course in advanced accounting that Edna completed in 1882, and that she regarded with the particular satisfaction of finishing something you began for your own reasons. Their 3rd child was born in 1882, another son, whom they named James, after no one in particular, and for no reason other than that it was a good solid name that sounded right. He had his father's dark hair and his grandmother's stubbornness, and a sunny disposition that seemed, in the family's private assessment, to be entirely his own contribution to the gene pool. By the time James was walking, and Samuel was in school, and Clara Mee was midway between the two, the foreman's house with the red curtains was a memory they spoke of, with the specific affection of places left behind that shaped you, and the new house with the east-facing porch was layered with years and children, and the accumulated evidence of a life fully inhabited, Samuel's marks measuring his height on the kitchen doorframe. Clara Mee's terrible watercolor paintings hung in the hallway by parental decision that would have made an art critic despair. The kitchen garden that had evolved over 8 years into something organized and productive and a little wild at the edges, which Edna said was exactly correct. There was an evening in the fall of 1882 when they were sitting on the east porch together after supper, the children inside doing the various things children do in the hour before bed, and the sky was doing the specific thing that the Kansas sky does in autumn evenings, going from blue to gold to a deep red-orange that seems too theatrical to be real and is absolutely real. And Ezekiel was drinking coffee and Edna was reading a letter from Margaret in Missouri, who was now happily married with 2 children of her own, and the silence between them was the very deepest kind of silence, the kind that is not absence of sound, but the presence of everything that does not need to be said because it is already entirely understood. Edna folded the letter and looked at the sky. "Do you remember," she said, "riding to Harrington in the dark? Every mile of it," he said. "I was so frightened," she said, "not of the dark or the riding, of what it would be like if it did not work, if Voss won somehow." She paused. "I had decided I would not marry him regardless of the consequences, but I had not worked out what the consequences would actually look like, and the not knowing was the frightening part." "I know," he said. "And you just appeared," she said, in the alley behind the livery with your horse on an ordinary morning, and everything shifted. It shifted for me too, he said. Earlier than I admitted to myself. She looked at him with those dark eyes that had been looking at him for 8 years, and that he still found he could look back at with the same complete attention as the first time. I am very glad, she said, that you are the kind of man who will ride through the night. I am very glad, he said, that you are the kind of woman worth riding through the night for. She reached across and put her hand over his on the arm of the chair, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that while the Kansas sky performed its evening extravagance, and the sounds of the children filtered out through the windows, and the autumn air moved through the grass with the sound of something breathing. This was the life they had built. Not in spite of Harlan Voss and $460 of debt and a November night of hard riding, but in some sense because of all of it, because the crisis had forced the things that needed to be said, and the actions that needed to be taken, and the hands that needed to reach for each other to reach. These things sometimes happen this way. A threat becomes the ground on which something true discovers itself. A dark road leads somewhere worth arriving. Inside the house, Clara Mee was apparently engaged in some dispute with Samuel involving the irreversible governance of a toy horse, and James, who at his age was primarily concerned with putting things into his mouth that did not belong there, was being supervised by Thomas Conley, who had come for supper and stayed because Tuesdays were often that way now, because families, when they are fortunate, tend toward each other in the evenings. Edna squeezed Ezekiel's hand once and then let go and picked up Margaret's letter again to finish reading it, and he picked up his coffee and watched the last of the red drain out of the sky, and he thought about how it is that life is made not from the large gestures and the dramatic moments, but from the accumulated weight of ordinary evenings, one after another, each one adding itself to the ledger of a life in the way that small and certain things add up to something that cannot be subtracted. He had ridden through the night for her. He would do it again, any night she needed it without question. But tonight was an ordinary evening in Kansas in the fall, and the porch was warm enough and the coffee was good, and his wife was beside him reading a letter and laughing softly at something her cousin had written. And inside the house, his father-in-law was telling his children a story in the voice he used for stories. And the land around the house stretched out in the last of the light in every direction. His land now, held in his name and worked by his hands, and everything that had been built was still standing. He set down his coffee cup and looked at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening east, the same stars that had lit their way to Harrington 8 years ago, and he felt a thing that he had no word for that was more than contentment and more than happiness. A sense of having arrived so completely in the right life that the idea of any other life was simply not available as a concept. Edna finished the letter, folded it, and held it in her lap, and looked at the stars with him. Margaret says she is expecting a 3rd child, she said. That is good news, he said. It is. A pause. She also says her husband is talking about moving to Colorado. Does that surprise you? Nothing about Margaret surprises me, Edna said. She once told me at age 14 that she intended to go somewhere interesting. I believe Colorado qualifies. He smiled. Where would you go, he asked, if you could go anywhere? She considered the question the way she always considered questions, with full attention, not dismissing it as rhetorical. Nowhere, she said finally. I would not go anywhere. He looked at her. I am already where I want to be, she said simply. He reached over and took her hand again, and this time she did not go back to the letter. They sat on the porch until Thomas Conley came to the door to say that James had fallen asleep in the armchair, and that Clara Mee and Samuel had reached some accord regarding the toy horse, and that he was going to head back to his own house before the night got any colder. And Edna went in to settle the children, and Ezekiel stood on the porch and shook his father-in-law's hand and watched him walk across the yard to the little path that led to the smaller house. And Thomas Conley turned once before he went around the fence line and raised a hand, and Ezekiel raised his in return, and then Thomas was gone in the dark, and Ezekiel stood a moment longer alone on the porch with the night air on. His face and the stars overhead and the sound of Edna's voice through the open window behind him, singing something low and not quite on pitch and absolutely beautiful. And he thought, this is what it is, all of it, the whole of it. Then he went inside and closed the door on the night, and the house was warm and the lamplight was golden and his family was there, every last one of them, and that was the end and the beginning and everything in between.